The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Earlier this year, my father sent out a coworker letter in which he referred to one of the last letters that Herbert W. Armstrong wrote before he died back in January of 1986. And as most of you here know, at that time, the church, the Worldwide Church of God, was truly a worldwide work, sending out a message over the airwaves, on TV, through the publications that was reaching millions of people. And the church itself had 700 congregations around the world, all over the world. Large congregations in major cities, 4 or 5 different churches in most cases, with 400 to 500 members attending each service. There were 1,200 ministers servicing those congregations. So this was, as I say, a large organization that stretched into many nations all over the earth, supported by hundreds of thousands of co-workers, and of course watched by millions, read by millions, if you think about the Plain Truth magazine, or the many booklets and books that Mr. Armstrong and the church produced. There was a sizable income supporting that effort. In 1985, for example, the total income for the church that year was $163 million. That's how supportive the people of God were in getting behind that work and getting behind the World Tomorrow program, which was on nearly 400 television stations. Lots of people enjoyed Mr. Armstrong's messages as they came out each week on TV, or as he wrote about in the Plain Truth, which had a circulation of 8.4 million. That was its peak back there in 1985 and on into 1986, the year that Mr. Armstrong died. And yet that letter, the one that my father referred to earlier this year, the one that Mr. Armstrong wrote just shortly before he died, in that letter, Mr. Armstrong talked about the greatest work being yet ahead of us. He came out with that classic statement, the greatest work lies yet ahead. The greatest work lies yet ahead of us. Let's begin this morning over in John chapter 4. The greatest work lies yet ahead. We know about the sad history in the Worldwide Church of God after Mr. Armstrong died. Much of this is written about in our book, Raising the Ruins, as we see how the successors to Mr. Armstrong went about systematically changing and tearing down everything that Mr. Armstrong had established, all the programs that he had raised up. Much of the literature, well, certainly all of his literature, was either discontinued or changed or altered, done away with. Think about what might have happened, though, had the work continued. With Mr. Armstrong, it was always about the work, and when Mr. DeKoch came along after him, and those that supported Mr. DeKoch, think about what could have happened had they continued the work. That's all, just continued the work. If they would have continued doing it. They didn't do that, of course, and the work just fell apart. Here in John chapter 4, we read of this account where Jesus came upon the woman at the well, Jacob's well, there in Samaria, and his disciples were off at the time in the city, at the market, buying food, preparing for the evening, and when they returned from the market, they were a little bit put off by the fact that Jesus was discussing whatever he was discussing with this woman. They didn't like it, that he was here with this Gentile woman, but you can read in verses 26 through 30 there, they held their peace, as it says, but I think Jesus understood and discerned that they had a problem with this. Look at verse 31, though. We'll get to the main point that I want to bring out here. He says, in the meanwhile, his disciples prayed him, saying, Master, eat. See, Jesus Christ needed some physical food, they thought. In fact, over the course of his ministry, he had missed many meals physically to get the work done, to fulfill God's will, to finish the job that God had given him to do. He denied himself some of those physical conveniences, even some of that physical sustenance, in order to fulfill God's will. Verse 32, he says, I have meat to eat that you know not of. And therefore said the disciples one to another, has any man brought him aught to eat? They didn't understand this. He says, I have food. And they thought, well, we were just off getting you food. Did someone come in the meantime and bring you a meal? Did someone hand you some meat along the way? They didn't yet have God's Spirit, so this statement confused them. They didn't understand about spiritual food, about spiritual meat. And so they were thinking on the physical realm only and wondered how he came upon a meal. Jesus, of course, went on to teach them something that he meant for all of us as his disciples to learn, and to learn deeply, that it's spiritual food that keeps us going, that it's spiritual food that keeps us nourished and strong, that it's spiritual food that enables us to do the work that God's given us to do. Verse 34 says, Jesus said unto them, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work. See, this is what fueled Jesus Christ. Here's where he obtained his real sustenance and strength. This was his purpose for being, finishing God's work. This was his life's passion. He was obsessed with this, you might say. He coveted the things of God. He wanted to finish the work of God. In the book John's Gospel, The Love of God, my father writes this is the key to having passion and high spirits. The work of God has a built-in vision of joy. It always keeps us looking beyond the difficulties of the present and seeing where this is all leading. There's a lengthy passage in that book, John's Gospel, about this very section of Scripture, John chapter 4. And as he says here, this is what keeps us going. This is what keeps us positive and in high spirits. God's passion, his goal, his desire is to finish the work. And that's why Jesus was so full of joy all the time, is because he made God's passion his own passion. He made God's desire his desire. And so everywhere that he went, even when he was persecuted and tried and tested, even when he was being crucified, human beings were not able to rob him of his joy. He was filled with joy. That's because his passion for the work was so strong. Now, when you think back upon the days of Mr. Armstrong, those final days of his life, even going back to that letter that he wrote there in 1985, that letter reflected a passion for doing God's work. Even when he was 93 years of age, what excitement Mr. Armstrong would always have when the subject of the work came up. If he was talking about the work, you can be sure that he was excited about it. This was his passion. This was his number one goal. And the problem with those that followed him is they lost that enthusiasm for doing God's work. They stopped doing God's work. Look at Malachi 1 and verse 12 on your own time. It says over there that the offering that these Laodiceans put forward or put onto the table is polluted. It calls the meat contemptible. It says the meat that those Laodiceans put on the table, it was contemptible. It was toxic. It was poisonous. Their offering, you see, wasn't healthy and nutritious. This, as I said, is brought out in great detail in Raising the Ruins. You see in that book what happens to the work of God when people lose interest in doing the work. When people lose that zeal, that passion to finish the work. Back to John's Gospel, the love of God, it says Christ wasn't even thinking about physical food. His mind was on why he, the Word, was made flesh He says, if you get your heart into God's work and give it everything you have, it will give you all the exuberance and joy God has to give us on earth. That's the example, you see, that Jesus set for us. 1 Peter 2 and verse 21. Follow in those steps. That's where our focus needs to be, on finishing the work. Jesus said in John 17 that I have finished the work that God gave me to do. And now in these latter days, in this end time, Jesus will finish the work through us, through the body of Christ, as we yield to Him. It always has to be about the work. The work. It always is about the work that God is doing. That's why Mr. Armstrong said in that last year of his life, the greatest work lies yet ahead. He could have rested, I suppose. He could have taken great pride in the fact that the work was already large at that point. It was already worldwide. It had already impacted millions. But he knew that there was much more to do. Look over at John 5. We'll come back to chapter 4 here in a second. But just to skip ahead a page or two in your Bible, John chapter 5 and verse 30. Jesus says, I can of mine own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father which has sent me. Here again, Jesus Christ's meat, his meal, his dish, his plate, spiritually speaking, was to fulfill the Father's will. It wasn't about him. It was never about him. Notice verse 31. He says, if I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. It wasn't about Jesus Christ. Now, this world desperately wants to make Christianity to be about Jesus Christ. That's the way it is in the traditional Christian world. But with God, it's about His work. With Jesus Christ, it was about God's work. And that's the example that we're expected to follow. If I bear witness of myself, Jesus said, it's not a true witness. This is not God's will. I'm here to fulfill God's will. I'm here to carry out God's purposes, to finish the work God has given me to do. Look at John chapter 8, again, a few pages over. There's so much in this gospel about the work and about Jesus Christ and the works that He performed and how they were of God. It was God in Him. Notice this attitude. You can see why Jesus accomplished as much as He did. Verse 28 of John 8, Then said Jesus unto them, When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then shall you know that I am He, or that I am, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father has taught me, I speak those things. I mean, this is just an incredibly selfless attitude. It's not about me or myself or my work. It's about what the Father has taught me, and I speak those things. I do those things that God has me to do. Verse 29, And He that sent me is with me. The Father has not left me alone, for I do always those things that please Him. See, if we're fulfilling God's will, then we're doing God's work. And as Jesus brings out there, if we're doing God's work, if we're fulfilling God's will, then we aren't alone. God is with us. God is behind us. God is supporting us. God is helping us. We're on the right side. We're on God's side. And He'll back everything that we pour into this work. So much of our efforts, though, at times can be misguided. The wheels can be spinning away. But if it becomes about us, then that's exactly what's happening. They're just spinning. And we're not really making progress. We're not really moving forward. As He spoke these words, many believed on Him. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on Him, If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed. This is just like many people today. Many traditional Christians will believe on Christ. They believe in Christ, but do they continue in His Word? Do they follow His example? Do they follow in His steps? Do they get behind God's work? Do they support God's mission? It's easy to say you believe on Christ. It's easy to call yourself a Christian. But the real difficulty, the real challenge comes in doing God's will instead of your own will. Read through to the end of this chapter sometime. It's an astonishing sequence of events. Many, it says here, believed on Jesus Christ, and yet what happened at the end of the chapter? What happened some 15 minutes later in this very exchange? Well, let's look at it. Look at the end of chapter 8, verse 58. Jesus said unto them, Truly, truly, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. I'm the one that God used to bring all of this into existence. As Ephesians 3:9 and John 1 brings out, God created all things through Christ. Verse 59, Then took they up stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Just a few minutes earlier, of course, as he was speaking these words, many believed on him, and 15 minutes later, they were looking for stones to cast upon him. They were looking for stones to kill him. Their religion was shallow. They weren't really in it for the work's sake. Back to John chapter 4. That's the way we'll be if we're shallow in our religious beliefs. We'll just be tossed to and fro, as Ephesians 4 says, with every wind of doctrine. One moment we'll be excitedly supposedly supporting Jesus Christ, and the next minute we'll be picking up stones to work against him. John 4 and verse 34, again it says, Jesus said unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish the work. See, that, students, is what our objective must be. Do whatever you can to help finish God's work. Be willing to serve in any area that you can, even if it's an unpleasant task. Jesus, he performed many unpleasant tasks, by the way. He had many unpleasant responsibilities. Any individual in a profession that they enjoy, that they love, would tell you that there's certain tasks that are difficult, that are not pleasant, that are not easy. Be willing to do those, though, for the work's sake. Be willing to do it in order to finish the objective God has for us. Verse 35 says, Say not you, there are yet 4 months, and then comes harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest. This is the verse that Mr. Armstrong referred back to in that final co-worker letter, or one of the final ones that he sent out. It's the same verse that my father spoke of earlier this year in his co-worker letter from April. The fields are ready. The fields are ready to be harvested. God says there's a huge harvest out there to be reaped. It's just waiting to be gathered. You know about God's overall purpose for man and how that the holy days remind us every year of these 2 harvesting seasons. The first small spring harvest, where God is collecting this first fruits harvest, as it's called in the Bible, His church, to assist Jesus Christ, to prepare for that great fall harvest, when all of mankind will have their minds open to the truth of God. God is always thinking about how this purpose and plan will expand, not just beyond a few thousand to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but to multiple, multiple millions. And much of that fruit and that growth, we know, it comes after the Great Tribulation. It comes during the world tomorrow. It's not about just getting supporters here to get behind this college campus or to fill another seat that might be next to you. That will happen too to some extent. But we've got to be thinking so much farther ahead. That's the way Jesus Christ thought. That's the way God the Father thinks. And He wants us, in the spirit of that, to be thinking about the harvesting that needs to be done now, what we need to finish and accomplish now. Mr. Armstrong wrote, this is from January 10th, 1986. This is the last letter he wrote to the church. He said, "The greatest work lies yet ahead." And then he said, "Never before in the history of the church has it been possible to reap so great a harvest. It has only been made possible through modern technology, beginning with the printing press, radio, television, the rapid mass transit, and mass communication." I mean, this was before the development of so many other technologies that we're now using to do the work. He said that in 1986. I mean, computers weren't even coming on the scene until the mid-'80s. And look at all that has developed since then. God has raised up those technologies for this work, believe it or not, because He wants the message to go out. It's such a small group of people who are faithfully supporting this work, much smaller than it should be, actually. But there's just a small group, and God has provided us with the means, with the technology, to get the work out to the largest audience possible. That's another phrase that Mr. Armstrong coined. The largest audience possible. He came out with those statements. The largest audience possible, or the greatest work lies yet ahead, because his mind was on the future. It was on expansion. It was on taking this message to the world. It was on doing God's work, not his own. There's one thing that we know about God's work. It's always expanding. It's always growing. It's always moving forward. The greatest work always lies ahead. In another booklet that my father wrote, the James booklet, he says, God is committed to finishing not just the first fruit harvest, but the entire harvest. God has only just gotten started with us. The greatest work lies yet ahead. See, my father carried on with that same catchphrase. In one of his own booklets, the greatest work lies yet ahead. Again, verse 35 says, "Say you not, there are yet 4 months, and then the harvest comes. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest." Don't say there's time to do it in the future. Don't say, well, we can always get to that tomorrow. Lift up your eyes and look. Open your eyes and see. That's what Christ is saying here. See what needs to be done. See how much farther this needs to go. See how much more you can do to be part of that. Back to the booklet on John's Gospel, the work is there. It's ready for more growth. The fields are already white to harvest. My father says we must not fail to harvest the crop. Times are urgent. Prospective members and co-workers and Laodiceans are waiting to hear this message, and then for ministers to help them while there is time. See, the whole world is waiting for us. It's waiting for the first fruits. Read through Romans 8 sometime. In fact, the universe is waiting for the first fruits. God's purpose and plan is going to expand even beyond the earth when it's all said and done. Verse 36, "And he that reaps receives wages, and gathers fruit unto life eternal, that both he that sows and he that reaps may rejoice together. And herein is that saying true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that whereon you bestowed no labor. Other men labored, and you are entered into their labors." Here we are, students, able to get in on the real exciting part of the job. I mean, many of the tasks that maybe were a little more unpleasant have already been done. There's a few students, alumni that are out there that came to this college, by the way, when it was just a field, an open field. And now look at where you are. Look at where you're sitting. How exciting it is to be where you are. What an opportunity God has put before you to extend the vision, to expand the work, to replicate it, to give it to others. We're so blessed with such wonderful truth, such a hope-filled work, the only hope for this dying world, in fact. And God has brought you here. He's brought you along to be part of it in order to support the work of getting that wonderful truth, that wonderful revelation out to the world. So lift up your eyes, as God says. The fields are ready to be harvested. The greatest work lies yet ahead.
Whenever Herbert W. Armstrong spoke about a program or a project that would help God's work, he always conveyed such tremendous enthusiasm and excitement. He loved God's work. It was his life. Now, if you've watched this program before, you probably know about what happened to God's work after Mr. Armstrong died. How his successors systematically destroyed the worldwide organization God built through him. That story is recounted in this free hardcover book called Raising the Ruins. Call the number on your screen and ask for Raising the Ruins, and we'll send you a free copy today. In this book, besides reading about the well-documented betrayal that happened inside the worldwide Church of God after Mr. Armstrong died, you'll also learn about the ongoing work to preserve and distribute Mr. Armstrong's teachings, to restore his global humanitarian empire, and to continue his legacy of service to mankind. Call now and request Raising the Ruins. There's no cost or obligation to you. Now, when you call, be sure to request our newest reprint in the Trumpet Daily reprint series, Laboring for the Harvest. This handout includes the letter my father wrote back in April 2011, just before the Trumpet Daily began. This is the same letter that we quoted from in today's forum. God says there is a huge harvest out there. Just lift up your eyes and you can see it, my father wrote in that letter. The fields are already white to harvest. We must not fail to harvest the crop. He said, in these urgent times, we must do our best to get out there and reap the harvest. As you heard during the main message today, the greatest work is still ahead of us. Call now and request Laboring for the Harvest and learn more about what you can do to support that work. Now, we also want you to become a Trumpet subscriber. As you can see from these sample issues here, the Trumpet magazine is a beautiful, high-quality monthly publication. And more important than that, the unique content in this beautiful publication will help you understand the real meaning behind the news.